we talked in that first lecture about the nature of theories, the importance of theories, the tests of theories. We went over the basic communication process, and we talked about systems theory because it's one of the broadest and most applicable theories that we have. We got started with just a little overview of information theory last time. We're going to continue with that, and we're going to move on into a discussion shortly of cybernetics, which is an application of information theory to system theory, and we'll see how those two work together to produce a third theory. But going back to our slide and looking at those terms that we were using last time, information entropy, peace, bit, turbulence, information load, uncertainty reduction. Those should become part of your vocabulary, should become natural words to you. Now, a bit is probably the trickiest term that you have up there, and a bit is used to cut in half the number of alternatives, HALF, to cut in half. So it involves the asking of binary questions, of yes-no type questions. And one way we can do that is to play a kind of little game. Imagine that I have a deck of playing cards here that you would play bridge or whatever with, and that we pull one card out of that deck. Now you should, I have written down, I think it's covered up here, I've written down the card that I pulled out of the deck, and I'll tell you later on what that is. Why don't you play along and write down whatever card if you've got cards there, you can actually pull one out. But we're going to, by going through what's using bits, we can determine what that card from the deck is, and I'll tell you why this is useful later. We can determine what that card is in either 5 or 6 questions that can be answered yes or no. We can determine what the card is. Now, we could also determine by pieces what the card is by just pulling, if we pull out a jack of spades and that's not correct, you know, when we go through 51 cards in the deck, then we would eventually know by process of elimination what the secret card or the pulled card might be. But that's not very efficient. So if we pose yes-no questions, and you would be asking me if we were face-to-face, and you ask me, is the card red? And my answer is no. Therefore, you know that the card is black. You have just cut in half the number of alternatives, and so you know that the card is black and not red, obviously, and so you've reduced your options from 52 to 26. So now that you've got a black card, you might ask me, is the card a spade? And my answer is yes. You again have cut in half your number of alternatives, and in 2 questions you've gone from 52 down to 13 cards. We're not using the jokers, by the way. Okay, we've got those 13 cards, and you now want to cut it in half again by using another bit or obtaining another bit of information. So maybe this time you say, is the card greater than 8? And the answer is yes. You could have said, is the card less than 9? I think that divides it in the middle. Anyway, the answer is yes. And so you know that the card is going to be 9, 10, Jack, Queen, or King. Maybe I should have said greater than 8. Okay, but you keep cutting it in half. You know, the answer is yes. So it's in that set, not the other set. Is it a face card? No. Now you've got it down to a 9 or a 10. And is it a 10? No. Therefore, it's a 9. And what I wrote down, you probably can't really read it, but I wrote down 9 of spades. Okay? You can test this out yourself. So what's the point of all this, Han? Why are we sitting here playing games about cards. And is it a test question? No, it's not a test question. And was that question a piece or a bit? Well, that was a piece of information, because you could ask me all day long, is this a test question? Is that a test question? Is this going to be on the test? Is that going to be on the test? And eventually I'll get tired of answering those questions, and I'll just say, I've said all I'm going to say about it. But often you know that often, in face-to-face situations with professors, you'll say something like, is the exam going to be essay? In my case, the answer is no. Therefore, it will be something else. Well, you cut roughly in half the choice between objective and non-objective. Is the test going to be multiple choice? No. We've now cut the objective options, maybe not perfectly in half, but we've seriously reduced the number of options, and we've narrowed the format down some more. Now, without bogging down in this too much, if you've surfed around WebCT much, you know that you already have online reviews for your 3 exams. The review questions are up there. There's a statement about taking the exams and not bringing your backpacks in or having to stack them down front and those kinds of things. But any time that you can reduce your alternatives by half, you're making much more efficient use of your information than if you are going through it piece by piece. Let's look at our next slide here. Okay, here's our definition of information. And information reduces uncertainty. It involves data, the process, the channel, the outcomes. And the information works in contrast to the element of entropy. In any situation, there's a certain amount of chaos, of randomness, turbulence. That's how much uncertainty there is in the situation. I'll give you another example in just a minute. Okay, a piece is just a unit of information. A bit, as I said before, cuts the alternatives by half. And when it's a decision between only 2 alternatives, that's a binary decision. Okay. For our purposes, we won't sort out the difference between chaos, entropy, and turbulence. But turbulence refers to the degree of stability or instability, and it affects the entropy. The more instability there is, then the greater the amount of chaos or entropy that you have. With information load, this refers to how much information combined with relative difficulty in transmission exist. And we'll see when we get to organizational theory near the end of the semester that persons often get burnout as a result of underload or overload. If you get too much information being transmitted, then you put too much electrical current on a wire, it burns out. Well, people are kind of the same way. You load too much information in and they burn out. Underload is equally undesirable from a human perspective. People who are bored beyond belief often quit their jobs, go find something else to do. I knew a person who took on a job as a fax machine operator, and that sounded pretty interesting in the beginning. She was very excited the first day when a big 100-page fax came in from Tokyo, and that was her job to make sure all the pages were there and get those pages in order and rush them up to the CEO promptly and so forth, and that made her feel very important, and that was a good thing. And then it was like 5 hours before another fax came in, and there was nothing to do in that time. She had no desk. She wasn't supposed to read a book on the job because that looked like lazy employees or something. And so she was suffering from underload and only lasted on that job about a day and a half. So the information load is the quantity of information, and later on we'll see that rate and complexity are the two elements that make up the dimensions of that load. And this is a concept we'll come back to when we get to organizations. Okay, uncertainty reduction is a term that we'll hear throughout the semester in various contexts. People seek information in order to reduce uncertainty. Sometimes we also create uncertainty by the information that we transmit. We want things to be ambiguous. We want people to not be sure what we're doing. So people may intentionally generate uncertainty. At the same time, most of us are seeking information to reduce uncertainty. And later on in the interpersonal unit, we'll see social cognition theory, how people come to know how to respond in particular social situations. And as we learn and gain knowledge of social situations, we are gaining information we are coming to know. And that's how it gets its name, social cognition theory. But how do you behave when you go to a particular restaurant? How do you behave at a football game? How do you behave at a social function? These kinds of things. Okay, we're going to shift now and go to an example of cybernetics and look at how these work together, because, and this is a relatively short little application, but remember we talked last lecture about systems theory and how a system is a set of interrelated parts that make up a whole, set apart by a boundary. In an environment, there's exchange with the environment, unless it's a closed system. Well, there are different levels of system. You know, we talked about the universe, we talked about the clock, we talked about human organizations and individuals, and down at a lower level there's the animal kingdom, and there are plants, and even at the level below that of cells, the cells in your body in their own little way, or anybody's cells, plant cells, animals, people. These all also function as a system. The little cell has to exchange oxygen or carbon dioxide or whatever its job is doing. There's this exchange function that's taking place. Well, right on the borderline between closed and open, and probably a slight bit more to the closed side, is the notion of cybernetics. And a cybernetic mechanism is something like the thermostat, the air conditioning system, a computerized guidance system. It can be very sophisticated, or it can be relatively simple, like the thermostat that controls the air conditioning. And that's kind of complicated to me, but it's not as complicated as the guidance system on a missile, for example. So let's look at the slide and look at our definition of cybernetics. Control and self-regulation via communication with an emphasis on feedback. Think about that. Control, self-regulation, communication, feedback. Now that applies, and we take a look at this because it also applies to people. But certainly we can see how those elements are coming together with a thermostat or a guidance system for a rocket or whatever. But in many ways, the human brain functions as a cybernetic mechanism too. And so we've got an analogy there. We have an analogous situation between the human brain and the cybernetic mechanism. And so that's why it makes it of particular interest to us as we study communication theory. Let's look at the next concept. Any cybernetic mechanism is going to have these parameters are these characteristics to it. Goal parameters, a control center. The control center will have a sensor, a comparator, an activator, it will also engage in some kind of feedback. And in a corrective action capability as well. I'm going to go ahead and say that, and then I'll give you an example. For example, if we're talking about our rocket system and the guidance system, there has to be some sensor mechanism. Let's talk about the air conditioning first and then talk about the rocket because it's simpler. With the air conditioning unit, the sensor picks up the heat or the cold, as the case may be, compares that to the setting on the thermostat, and then either activates or doesn't. If the comparator says we've got a mismatch here, then there's an activation of the system, and either the heat comes on or the cooling comes on. Okay, and that's a corrective action. Okay, with something like the guidance system, we'll let my pen here be a little rocket ship. You know, Cape Kennedy, or is it Canaveral these days? They switch it back and forth. The rocket takes off. Now, the rocket is supposed to have a certain deviation to it. You know, it has a trajectory, so it doesn't just go straight up. It takes off at some kind of an angle. And if it's right on track, that's positive feedback. Okay, the sensor would say it's deviating a degree or 2 degrees or however, whatever it's supposed to change as it launches. It's exactly on track even though it's changing. Well, that's positive feedback. But if for some reason it takes off and it's wobbling, or it takes off and it's running horizontal to the Atlantic Ocean, you know, this is not a good thing. And that's negative feedback. So the point of this being that sometimes you need for the deviation to change in a corrective way. Sometimes you need for the deviation to continue the way that it is deviating because it's still positive feedback. Here's our Concorde, which is no more. Okay. The same kind of thing occurs when, if you're maybe in a course that's got 10 little exams. Now in this class you've got 3 exams and a paper. So it's harder to get a pattern to it, harder to develop that pattern. But say you've got a course that has 10 homework assignments, maybe it's a math class or something like that. And your grades, you know, you make a 70 and then you make a 78 and then you make an 84 and an 88 and a 92. That's positive feedback because you're going in the right direction. But if it goes like this, you know, you make an 82 and then you make a 74 and then you make an 86 and a 71 and a 95 and a 62, you've got negative feedback in there, and you need a total corrective action to get it back on track. So anyway, because the human brain works as this is analogous to the cybernetic mechanism, our brains do the same sort of thing. They give us feedback, and it could be in a dating relationship. You know, I'm doing fine here. This is cool. This is working. You know, I got my moves right, or whatever your brain tells you in those situations. And you know, and you decide whether you're going to maintain that feedback or if you need a corrective action, need to change your whole style and method of dealing with that. Okay, hopefully that's all clear and we are ready to move along. And we're going to turn next to some theories of language and language processing. And let me flip over here and make sure that I'm on the right page, because it's good when we're all on the same page. Okay, and Dr. Williamson, whom I mentioned earlier, helped in the development of this content and getting these slides together. Okay, if you're working from my textbook, about page 30, 33 along in there is where this unit starts. Page numbers will probably change a little bit from semester to semester depending on which edition we're in. Okay, the first thing that in this unit we're moving into the realm of what some people call intrapersonal communication, how things work inside your head. Dr. Douglas, whom many of you know, who teaches here, published an article some years ago now. We've all been here a while. But it had a very clever title that said, "Excuse me, but have I been talking to myself?" And if you know his accent, you can hear him saying that. Well, yes, sometimes we do talk to ourselves. That's intrapersonal. Nobody else has to be around. Some people even talk out loud. I try not to do that when I'm talking to myself. But certainly we have internal thought. Now, for some people, that's just your basic thought processes. But for some other folks, it really takes kind of the framework of dialogue, and we actually discuss things with ourselves. Sometimes, or you do. I'm not confessing here. Okay. A sign is a stimulus that has meaning for people. You know, and so we need to get some basic terminology down here for this. But messages are signs or groups of signs that are shaped through human thought processes. Sometimes we have trouble getting the label on things. You know, you try to come up with the right word. Maybe you're trying to remember the name of a person, you know, and you know the person. They live next door to your parents for years, or it's somebody you just had class with last semester, and but you can't get it out of there. Well, you're having a problem connecting the sign with the stimulus and identifying the symbol for that person. But you know, what I'm delivering to you now constitutes a group of signs, and this all makes sense to me, you know, and I think I've shaped it rather well. I mean, I'd be kind of backwards if I said, well, I'm intentionally sitting here delivering the most disorganized lecture that I could possibly concoct because my goal is to confuse you. Now, some of you will think that that's what I was doing, and some of you will be confused even when we get through, but I'm trying not to make it my fault. And I know I hit the microphone, guys, sorry. Okay, so these messages are groups of signs that are shaped through our thought processes. Signs represent objects, events, and conditions other than themselves, whether it's a traffic sign, whether it's the traffic light, whether it's these little squiggly lines that are up on your visual aid that you're on your PowerPoint slide that you're looking at right now. These represent things other than themselves. So we're going to be looking in this unit at how this mapping process takes place and how we get to this representational theory of things. And we'll actually see a theory shortly that's called that. Okay, verbal coding is the first area. We'll look at nonverbal later on. Okay, coding is the process of relating signs to their reference. The process of relating signs to their reference. A signal indicates the presence of an object other than itself. It's time and context bound. A symbol arouses in a person a conception of the object, event, or condition, and it's context free. Okay, so the signal is actually in a context. A symbol is not. and we don't have to worry about that a lot, but the line gets kind of thin sometimes between those. But whether we're dealing with traffic signs, traffic signals, you know, how many of you think that your cat or your dog communicates with you? And most of you dog owners, you're probably coming, yeah, you know. Well, most of us, and when this is the kind of thing Dr. Williams and I sit around and discuss at lunch, but probably what's happening, but I don't want to take you on a war over this, probably what's happening is that you're really engaging in signal behavior, and that your pet has you trained almost as well as you have them trained. You know, with my daughter's German Shepherd, if we say, "Where's your toy? Where's your toy? Go get the toy." I don't know that she really understands TOY. I think that she probably understands the vocal inflection. She knows to go get her toy. So there is some kind of communication going on here. There's an exchange of meaning in that encoding and decoding process. Okay? But it may be the nonverbal intonation that is having more of an impact than the actual choice of TOY. Don't know. You can wonder about that. Okay, certainly she can't read the word. You know, if you put the letters TOY up there, nothing's happening. My cats get really excited over the can opener, but you know, until they get into the kitchen and a different channel takes over, as long as they're on audio and they're hearing the can opener, they can't tell whether it's tuna or pineapple chunks. Once they get to the kitchen and there's a different channel, the olfactory or sense of smell takes over, then they know, okay, Mom's opened something really interesting here and I want a sample, i.e. the tuna. Or, oh, she opened a can, but it's not for us, so forget it. We'll just hang around and see if she opens something better. So our use of signs and symbols is very important, is very significant. One might ask, if you stop for a minute and think about it, why did, and I think you've got this in your book as one of your probes, why when the Germans, the Spanish, the French, all these people came to America and went exploring this direction and that direction and so forth, why did they rename everything? Don't you think that the Indians had already put a name on stuff that was important? Big tall points sticking up. They had names for rivers, names for this area, that area. So why would people go back through and rename these things? Why did, back when we were first investigating the moon and so forth, did the Russians and the Americans have different names? Sea of Tranquility is the only thing I can think of right now, and I probably couldn't identify that if I even had a moon map here. Why did we put different names on things? Well, if you guessed control, that's a good guess. Because we control our own symbols, we control the symbols of our language, we need labels that are in a language that we understand in order to be able to communicate with each other about those things. And trying to communicate in a foreign language is more difficult. And so that was one way of gaining control of the environment in a new country, on the moon, in new situations. Okay, let's go on with our verbal coding here. We use these signs to elicit and formulate behavior. Whoops, one too many. Okay. Oh. You can confess this to yourself because I can't hear you. Traffic lights. Green means go. Red means stop. What does the yellow light mean? Now, what does it really mean to you? Now, it's supposed to mean slow down, be ready to stop for red. But if you watch some of the intersections around here, and North McGregor at Scott is one of my favorites for a variety of reasons, yellow usually means at that intersection, step on the gas and go just as fast as you can and see if you can't clear the intersection before the light turns red and hope that no police officer is watching. For some people, the red light even means one more car can go through before the other side starts up. But these signs elicit our behavior. So whether the yellow traffic light means slow down or accelerate really fast depends on how you and the people around you interpret that sign. Okay, the same thing happens with sign behavior with people. You see someone carrying packages trying to get through a door. What's that a sign of? Well, perhaps that they need some help getting through that particular door. So you will formulate your behavior based on that. You're going to sit down and be ready to laugh if they drop everything, or you're going to walk a little faster and get up there and say something like, "Here, let me help you," and open the door for them. You know, and there are all kinds of possibilities. The point being, the sign elicits and helps formulate your behavior. Signs have relationship to other signs, whether it's arrows showing you which way to walk, exit signs, gasoline price signs, you know, which gasoline are you going to choose? The least expensive, the highest octane, whatever. Okay, we'll see in communication how one's reality is represented both to yourself and to others with signs. Okay, all this talking that I'm doing today represents my opinion of where the status of communication theory is and what you need to know about it, and so on. The study of signs and or not nonverbal. Let's do that one again. The study of signs and or verbal coding can be approached in 3 different ways. Semantics, pragmatics, and syntactics. And you can get a PhD in any of these areas if you're interested. Semantics looks at how signs relate to meaning, what words mean. And words don't mean the same thing to different people. Words don't mean the same thing across different contexts. Some cultures don't even have signs for certain meanings. Pragmatics, how the signs affect human behavior. It would be a pragmatic study to take a look at how the traffic lights, for example, affect behavior, or how a no talking sign affects behavior. Syntactics looks at how the signs relate to other signs. Okay, language is a structured sequence of speech sounds, and they're organized through rules or syntax. Speakers of a language must acquire an intuitive knowledge of grammar. People must be able to use their knowledge of grammar to create and understand novel sentences. Okay, think about that for just a minute. How is it, think about this, how is it that we can say things that we've never said before? How is it that we can understand things that we've never heard before? Are we born with an innate ability to understand language and to speak? Or is this a learned behavior? Is it some combination of the two? When we get to Chomsky, well, we'll only look at him briefly, but we'll see how his approach to generative grammar addresses this issue. But before we look at a specific theory, I want you to think about that, because you're all out there communicating and using language. How did you get that way? What happens to an infant that is left in isolation, that is separated from humans, that or has very limited contact with human beings? How do we develop language? Okay, the classical structural linguistics approach asks, how is language structured? What kind of syntactical units are there? What kind of relations are there within a sentence? And we won't go too far with this, but we pick up words like phonology, morphology, syntactics, and lexical level. People who study sounds, and a speech therapist, for example, is an example of an area where people look at the formation of sounds, and you break the words down to s, a, ouns, or p, b, f, k, l. And are those sounds made through the nose, like m and n? And you know, if you hold your nose, it's difficult to make an m. It gets distorted. Ing. You know, there are certain m and n and ing especially. Well, phonology is the study of these sounds and how we make those, and not just how we make them, but what those sounds mean in different situations too. Morphology is the study of words. How do words morph over time? How do they change over time? Some words come into our vocabulary, and you know, the whole information age and computer age brought in a set of jargon and vocabulary words with CDs and DVDs and RAMs and ROMs and CPUs and on and on. And so the study of words would look at, or morphology would look at how those words have developed, also how words change over time. A friend of mine recently taught me a word that has gone out of vogue, but maybe it'll come back if I put it in this lecture, and I can't even remember now where she found it, but the word is gosh-bustified. Gosh-bustified. And apparently in the 1800s, that was a really good word. It was a regular, everyday kind of word, and it's a word that one used if they were having a really fine day. It was a gosh-bustified kind of day. So if you need a new vocabulary word to revive and put back in circulation here, well, you know, go out and tell all of your friends to have a gosh-bustified day. It's kind of a mouthful. Okay, but if that word actually comes back into vogue, you know, the morphologist would say, okay, look at that. Kind of like hula hoops. You know, those hula hoop wasn't around for a long time, came and went. I don't know if ice box is in the vocabulary anymore or not. Most of you probably don't even know. You may see somebody call a refrigerator an ice box, but the odds are that you don't know what a true ice box was. But it got its name, as one of my friends would say, 100 years ago, and up until not too long ago. I don't know when they went out of vogue. But anyway, the ice box had a part, it was the equivalent of and predated the refrigerator, but the top of the box opened and the iceman came along and sold you great big chunks of ice that weighed 40 or 50 or more pounds. Excuse me. And they put that ice up there in the top and closed it up, and then it melted and ran down the aluminum and kept the food products relatively cold, at least chilled in there, until all the ice melted. Okay. Ice box then, it morphed, and there were people of my parents' generation, and to some extent my generation, who then went ahead and called the new refrigerators ice boxes, even though they no longer had ice on top, because the ice box also referred to what kept the food cold. Anyway, enough of that. Okay, syntactics, the rules for grammar. If you have taken a foreign language, or if you still have that exciting adventure to go, one of the things you will do is learn the syntactics of that particular language. You'll have to conjugate verbs and learn the present and the past perfect, and the present perfect and the future perfect, and if I'm remembering right, Latin also had a pluperfect to it. There was an old Davy Crockett movie 100 years ago where Davy was helping his son learn his vocabulary or conjugate his verbs, and it went, I ain't a-fixin' to, you ain't a-fixin' to, they ain't a-fixin' to, and so forth. So whatever the words are, syntactics have to do with the rules for the grammar. That's something that's going to be very important in the papers that you write in this course, and those instructions are online for you too. But you have to know the syntactics of English. You have to match the subjects with the verbs. They been going is not correct. We was going is not correct, and so forth. There are rules for grammar. The pronouns have to match the reference. If it's a plural subject, then it's a plural pronoun referent. If it's a single subject, it's a single pronoun referent, and so forth. And there are many, many rules for grammar, but these are some of the kinds of things that we get in trouble with. In our written language, we usually have a higher standard than we do in our spoken language, in part because sometimes when you start a sentence, you don't always know where it's going before you finish it. Or when you, kind of like that one, when you finish the sentence, it may end up someplace that you didn't know you were going when you started it. Okay, the lexical level has to do with the meanings of the words. There must be another line up here. There. And the word combinations. The meaning of the words, the word combinations. If the words don't make any sense, then that's problematic. I heard somebody use the word ameliorate the other day in the wrong but I can't think now. But anyway, the girl used the word wrong. I can't remember now what word. I shouldn't have gone into that example because I can't remember what she wanted. But anyway, she used the wrong word for the situation, and that was a lexical average. Now that was a lexical error. I wanted error instead of average, and so that word combination didn't fit together. I did not plan that mistake. Okay, there are psychological approaches to language. And these ask questions like, how is language used? What mental processes are used in speech production and reception? And this is a useful area for communicators to study as well. And when we get to narrative theory, we'll look more specifically at the characteristics of that. But in research questions, we may be looking at how the stories people tell shape particular outcomes. And you may even ask yourself sometime, what were they thinking? What was that person thinking when he or she said that? That was a really stupid thing to say. Or, that was incredibly perceptive. You know, sometimes little people, 4 or 5 years old, will say something that is particularly insightful, and we wonder what kind of mental process went on that caused them to be able to produce that insight at that particular age. But anyway, psychological approaches look at how we are using language and what kind of mental process is taking place in this production reception process. And we'll be looking shortly at the triangle of meaning, at Osgood's semantic space models, and they help to some extent in explaining these. Okay, the behavioristic approach, which is probably of less direct relevance to us, but if you've had a psych class, this is where good old B.F. Skinner comes in. And certainly in communication, there are stimulus-response situations. Can you think of one? We actually engage in a lot of ritualistic behavior that is stimulus-response. Think about that. If someone comes up to you and says, "Hi, how you doing?" You just look at them? Well, maybe if you're trying to make some kind of an unusual point. But the odds are, if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, how you doing?" you say, "Fine, how are you doing?" Or some other kind of preset response. But that's a stimulus response type of behavior. Something stimulated the response on the part of the other person. It's conditioned. It's been reinforced over time. It's affected by use frequency. There may be some people that you encounter that you always share a compliment with, like the color you're wearing today, or hair looks good, or hey, you washed your car, yeah, well, da-da-da, you know. And we develop patterns that are familiar, that are consistent with particular people in particular situations, and that's a conditioned, reinforced stimulus response type of behavior. Okay, now we turn our attention to Chomsky and what's called generative grammar, because Chomsky was particularly concerned with how people are able to generate novel sentences. He looks at the ideal speaker-listener relationship, and he uses words like competence and performance as key concepts. But think about the language development on the part of a child. Okay, we know that if we have an infant and not that we would ever do this on purpose, but I don't think anybody would, but if the child has been closed away from people, if they've not had interaction with people who use language on a regular, consistent basis, then they have poor vocabulary development. And we know that it's quite an effort for most small children, unless they're really, really bright, to develop their vocabulary. They have to learn the names of things. And as we talked earlier about the last lecture about the explorers gaining control of their environment by naming things, the infant, the small child, gains control of his or her environment by learning the names of things in that situation. But somehow there's a leap that occurs. A connection occurs at a different level of sophistication, because we move along the line from things like say bye-bye, say bye-bye, good, bye-bye, or say hi, you know, that little instructional kind of thing that gets the kids talking and so on. At some point, they start making they start chattering. They usually by age 3 or 4, they're just talking you crazy, and they're making up sentences that you never taught them. They're saying things that perhaps you never thought about. They're saying things from their own world point of view. And I'll tell a story from one of my grandkids, which reflects this world view sort of notion, and we'll see more of this later on too. But I had picked up the 4-year-old one day, and we were going somewhere. We were going across railroad tracks, and the diesel engine was stopped just short of making the cross arms come down. And so I thought, well, I'll go over the tracks very slowly, and I said, look at the big train, you're just sitting there, you know, ooh, it's so big. And she looked at me and said, Grandma, why is that train just sitting there? Well, immediately my brain flashed on, it's waiting on the siding for another train to pass, trains have schedule, all the things that I know about trains and why trains could be stopped. And I thought, this is probably more than any 4-year-old's brain is really ready to handle. Well, one way to cope when you don't really know what the answer is to ask a question as a response to the question. So I thought, okay, that ploy will work at this. You know, I didn't have teacher training for nothing. So I said, well, I'm not sure. Why do you think that the train is sitting there? And without missing a beat and hardly blinking, she said, I think it needs a new battery. Well, now that thought never crossed my mind. But from her worldview, from her perspective, that made good sense. So we generate sentences from our point of view. When we get to the linguistic relativity theory later on, we'll see how this worldview, our own ethnocentric point of view about things, is even more significant as we try to communicate cross-culturally. And we have whole courses in cross-cultural or intercultural communication as well. Okay, so Chomsky was concerned then with what it is that's going on that at some point enables us to make these unique utterances with one another. And he said there's a difference between deep structure and surface structure. And at the deep level, there's an abstract sentence that's mostly in the mind of the speaker, and at the surface level, they're the things that actually come out of our mouth that's produced from the deeper structures through these transformations. And so we get, forgot my example I was going to give you. Oh, I know. Somehow the human brain is able to determine and understand that the ball was hit by John, passive voice, means the same thing as John hit the ball, active voice. And we just know and understand that. Nobody had to really explain that to most folks along the way. So anyway, Chomsky is saying there's some things deep in your brain that are kind of innate, and that these deep structures are what enables us to produce the surface structures that we hear. But there's still a two-camp division between the behaviorists who say that language is learned and the nativists who say that language is innate. And you can get in either camp that you want to. I'm probably going to hedge and say that it's probably a blend of the two, that we have to learn our vocabulary, we have to learn what the words mean, we have to learn the order of the sentences. Does the verb go after the subject or at the end of the sentence? Seems like when I took German that the subject was always first or third and the verb was usually last, at least in regular, the most frequent distribution in the sentences. So, and yet at the same time, I recognize that there are novel utterances that we have not learned. And so there must be something innate that's going on that contributes to this. Okay, let's pull up our next slides and keep going. and you can weigh in on this wherever you want to. Okay, we're moving along with the idea of theories of thinking and how our conceptual behavior works. And in this course, you write a paper late in the semester. Well, not too late, it's due at exam too, so it's 2/3 of the way through. That deals with the notion of, well, the paper deals with applying concepts. And it's not applying theories, it's applying concepts from the theories, and those guidelines are on your syllabus, and there's a sample paper online, and there's sample papers in the back of the book. So I'm not going to bog down here with that part, but it's to say pay attention to this part of the lecture or this segment of the material, because we're going to talk right now about what a concept is. And it's kind of like the term communication. It's both clear and unclear all at the same time. But our thinking involves concepts. When you go to the grocery store, for example, and you want to buy fruit, okay, fruit is a concept. You don't go into the meat market to buy fruit, I hope, okay? And you don't go into the fruit and vegetables area to buy meat, because meat, fruit, vegetables, these are different concepts, okay? And as a young child, you know, you'll learn those categories first. The same grandchild I referenced a while ago will eat most meats as long as you call it steak. Okay, but if you say, do you want some fish or do you want some chicken? No, I don't like chicken. Well, this is white. It's really, you can call it white steak if you want to. Oh, okay. So then she'll taste it and she likes it. Okay. Well, this is it's a naming game, but it also has to do with concepts. And at that point in her development, she'd learned that she liked steak. On those occasions, you know, she had to learn that hamburger is chopped up steak, we wish. Okay, so chopped up steak is okay, and steak is okay. White steak is better than she thought it would be, and so forth. Okay, think about the concept of snow for a minute, and then we'll get back to the theory part. Think about snow. I hope you've seen snow. Every once in a while I encounter some Houston people who've not seen snow yet. Okay, but in English, and at least in Texas English, I guess, is that snow instead of snow? In Texas English, we have snow. Okay, but if you move to the north, we at least add adjectives to it. There's dry snow and wet snow. If you move to Alaska, in English I'm not sure whether you have some different words, but I'm told, I don't speak Eskimo, but I'm told that the Eskimos have 14 different words for snow. Okay, we know we have one word for love, but that the Greeks had, I think, up to 4 words, filial and agape and eros, and the fourth one's slipping my mind right now. And so we borrow from that language to distinguish between types of love. Well, if you're in Alaska, you need more than one word for snow. You need to know if it's heavy snow, if it's light snow, if it's powdery snow, if it's very wet snow. I don't know what else there is to know about snow, but I'm sure there is if you have to get out and pull a dog sled and so forth. I know that you can't make a snowman out of dry snow, out of powdery snow. It won't stick together. Okay, you need the good wet snow. Well, the point being that these are concepts. These are concepts of snow. And if you're real particular about your apples, then you know the difference between red apples and green apples and golden apples. And if you're even more particular, you can divide the red apples into what? American Beauty, Rome. That's about as far as I'm getting with the apples. You know, I go to the open market and I'm amazed at how many kinds are there, some of which I've never heard of. For the people who run the store, it's important to know those differences. Okay, let's go back to our slide now and look at our definitions and why this is important. Thinking involves conceptual behavior. Think about that. Think about thinking. Okay, because if I say, will you go to the store and get some apples for me, if you don't know the difference, you'll just pick up any apples. Or you may think only the red apples are really apples and that anything that's not red couldn't possibly be an apple. Okay, well, how do we get this concept formation? Whether it's snow or theoretical concepts in this class, microbiology, you know, if you're going to name all those little germs under the slides. My son-in-law is a medical doctor and a pathologist, and he can just name dozens of things on slides. You know, he's got areas of concept formation that I don't even start to understand. Okay, there are two schools of thought, behavioristic and cognitive. Some concepts we learn through behaviors. You get a swat on your backside from your parent, and that's more a stimulus response, behavioristic kind of learning experience. Cognitive school is what you're engaging in at the university. You know, I mean, in some classes you have some field trips. In your production classes, you get hands-on experience with your cameras and equipment and so forth. But much of what we are about as a university is a cognitive process. Well, Byrne gave us a definition of a concept, and said that a concept is formed whenever two or more distinguishable objects or events have been grouped or classified together on the basis of some common feature or property. So all the plants and all the animals, you know, we've got all these taxonomies, and a taxonomy is just a list. A taxonomy of the animal kingdom and a taxonomy of the plant kingdom, and then you have a taxonomy of fruits and a taxonomy of cuts of meat. And in the course of this semester, you'll look at a couple of taxonomies. A taxonomy is just a list of related items, related concepts, but one doesn't cause the other. So with fruits, you know, you can, if we go back to the slide, the common feature or property for apples is that they're all fruits, they're all red, they're all food, and that puts them in a particular category. Okay, the conceptual behavior is important because, one, we have to learn the concept. Some people get annoyed with me in this class. They get annoyed with Dr. Heath, too. It's just a function of the course. Because you have to learn a lot of concepts. And sometimes people will say, well, we're just memorizing concepts and we're not using them. Well, that's because we can't make you do everything in one semester. We would try if we could. You'll use concepts a little bit when you write your paper. For me, I think the last time I checked with Dr. Heath, he had people applying the whole theory rather than applying the concepts, but same idea. The first thing you have to do is learn those concepts, because you can't apply them until you've learned them. Can I apply an analysis can I identify types of germs if I don't know what they look like? If I don't know what they, you know, if I look at a slide, am I going to know this person has measles or chicken pox or cancer or Alzheimer's, or, I mean, that would be after the fact, of course. But But unless I know what these things look like, I can't use them in any kind of application. Well, when the same is true, that we have to learn the concepts first, and then we're able to use them. And so occasionally students come back to me, and it's kind of amusing because they'll say, you know, I experienced cognitive dissonance the other day. It was a remarkable thing. I didn't think I'd ever use any of that stuff from class, but there was a term that I used, or they learned their 14 compliance gaining strategies and say, oh, you know, ever since I left the class, I've been going around watching people use compliance gaining strategies on me. Or I decided to dump my girlfriend, or I decided to dump my boyfriend, and I remembered that we had Baxter's strategies for relationship disengagement. That's the next unit. And so we had a state of the relationship talk, but that didn't work very well. And so finally one day I just said, fait accompli, it's done, it's over with. Now these terms will make more sense to you when we get to that taxonomy and go through and define them. But the point being, people are able to use concepts. Somewhere along the way, a lot of you picked up the notion of passive-aggressive communication. That's a phrase that I think got lifted out of the psychological literature, you know, but you know, I just broke off the relationship because I was tired of all the passive-aggressive games. Well, now, how do you know that was a passive-aggressive game? Somebody taught you what the concept means, and you couldn't apply it and say that was passive-aggressive behavior or this was hostile bullying behavior until you learned what that concept meant. You know, the person behaved rudely. What is rude? Rude is a concept. And you don't know if somebody is being rude until you know what that word means. And after you learn what it means, then hopefully you're able to apply it in a particular situation. Okay, if we look at Miller, Gallant, and Pribram, who are some of the theorists who've dealt with what they call a cybernetic approach to using concepts, and this is relatively simple. They observed that thinking involves planning. Now later on we'll get to action outcome theory, and we'll see how people really set goals and plan for particular outcomes. But they're talking here, excuse me, about just overlaying that cybernetic model that we talked about earlier of thinking as involving planning, that thinking is a cybernetic mechanism. We sense feedback and we adjust accordingly. And so they say it's kind of, TOTE is easy to remember, a little acronym. Test, operate, test, exit. Now think of some examples. You say, I don't do that. Think about it. If, for example, somebody is sarcastic to you, are you sarcastic back? They make a snippy remark and you make a snippy remark back. If that happens, what kind of outcome do you get? Does this escalate? Or think about the police officer who stops you and is ever so polite and you're fuming. But if one person speaks with a hostile voice and the next person speaks in a low, calm voice, usually that de-accelerates the situation, or de-escalates, that's the word I want. Slows things down, brings things to a calmer level. So we adjust our feedback accordingly. We try concepts out and see how they work, and if they don't work so well, we try something else. And if they do work well, then we use them again in that situation. Okay, this is a good stopping point for this lecture. We'll continue next time.